My name's Gudrid. I am old now. The sagas they tell about my life are just stories. They get some things right, but they leave out the feeling of the salt spray on your face for a month. And they forget the taste of rainwater after a week of drinking from a sour cask. My husband, Thorfinn Karlsefni, was a good man, a great explorer, but he was just a man. He got seasick like everyone else. He worried when the fog rolled in and we could not see the sun. We sailed from Greenland around the year 1004. There were 3 ships, maybe 160 people, men, women, and our livestock. We were going to a new land. Leif Erikson had been there. He called it Vinland, a land of grapes and self-sown wheat. It sounded like a paradise, a place to build a new life away from the rocky shores of Greenland. The voyage was long, longer than any I had taken before. Days turned into weeks. The world was just 3 things: the gray water, the gray sky, and the groaning wood of our ship. I learned to sleep with the rocking of the waves. I learned to eat dried fish until my gums were sore. I learned the faces of every person on that ship, their hopes, their fears. We found the place Leif had described. We built our settlement. It was a hard life, but a good one. There was so much wood, the trees were huge, the rivers were full of fish, and it was there, in that new world, that my son was born. We named him Snorri. Snorri Thorfinnsson. He was born in a longhouse we built with our own hands. He took his first breaths smelling the pine smoke of a new continent. He was the first, the first of our people born so far from home. We did not know it then. We were just trying to survive. But the new world was not empty. The Skraelings, the people who lived there, were at first curious. We traded with them, milk for furs. Then there was misunderstanding, fear, a fight. A man was killed. We knew then we could not stay. The dream of Vinland was over. We packed our ships. We left the longhouses to the forest. My son Snorri was almost 3 years old. He would have no memory of the land of his birth. We sailed home, back across the great ocean. The journey back was just as hard, just as long. It was on that journey that I truly understood the sagas talk of glory and discovery. They do not talk about the cost. They do not talk about the endless days of nothing, the gnawing hunger, the constant cold, the fear that you are just a speck of wood in an angry ocean and you will never see land again. They do not talk about the brutal truth of it. That is what I remember. That is the part of the story they always leave out. Number 15, you are never alone and always lonely. His name was Rolf. He was 20 years old. He had never been on a long voyage before. He had sailed the fjords around his home near Kaupang. But that was child's play. This was a journey to Iceland. The year was 875. The promise was land. Good land, not the rocky scraps left in Norway. He signed on with a chieftain named Ketil Flatnose. Rolf was a farmer, not a sailor, but he was strong and willing to learn. He packed his few belongings in a wooden sea chest, his kista. It was carved with knots and held his spare tunic, a whetstone, and a small wooden horse his father had made for him. The ship was a nar, a trading vessel. It was fatter and slower than a longship, but it could hold more cargo, more people. There were 60 souls on board, men, women, children, and a handful of thralls, plus chickens, 2 goats, and a ram that smelled worse than anything Rolf had ever encountered. The ship was about 54 feet long and 15 feet wide. That sounds big. It is not. Not for 60 people and their lives. Rolf's kista was his world. It was his chair, his table, and his only piece of private property. When he sat on it, his knees would touch the back of the man in front of him. When he tried to sleep, he would lay on the deck, his head resting against his kista, but there was no real sleep. There was only a series of brief dozes interrupted by a foot in his face or the shifting weight of the person next to him. And there was no below deck for passengers. The space below the loose floorboards was for cargo. Everyone lived on the open deck under a large woolen tent, the jald that was stretched over the middle of the ship in bad weather. It did not keep all the rain out. It just made the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Rolf learned quickly that privacy was a concept that did not exist at sea. To relieve himself, he had to go to the side of the ship, in full view of everyone. Modesty was a luxury you left on the shore. Conversations were never private. Every argument, every prayer, every whisper was public. A woman sobbed for her mother she left behind. A man cursed his brother over a stolen piece of dried cod. Rolf heard it all. He could not escape it. At first he tried to keep to himself. He would sit on his chest and stare out at the endless gray sea. But the sea was always the same. He found himself watching the others. He learned their faces, their habits. He knew that old Orm gnashed his teeth in his sleep. He knew the young woman, Freyja, hummed the same sad tune over and over. He knew their stories, not because they told him, but because he could not help but overhear their lives being lived 2 feet away from his own ears. And yet he felt a deep, aching loneliness. He was surrounded by people pressed in on all sides, but he had never felt so isolated. These were not his family. They were not his friends from his village. They were strangers, all thrown together in this wooden bowl, each with their own fears and dreams. He could not speak of his own fear. The fear that they were lost. The fear that the next wave would be the one to swallow them whole. To show fear was to show weakness, and on a ship like this, weakness was a danger to everyone. One night, a storm hit. The child was ripped away, rain and spray lashed across the deck. Everyone huddled together for warmth, a single mass of shivering humanity. Rolf was pressed between a large, silent man named Gunnar and a small, terrified boy who was traveling with his mother. He could feel Gunnar's every breath. He could feel the boy's small body trembling against his side. He was not alone. But as he looked out at the churning black water, at the vast empty darkness, he understood, you could be surrounded by the whole world on one of these ships. But in your heart, in the place where the real fear lived, you were completely and utterly on your own. His Kista, his tiny island of personal space, was just a box. It could not hold back the loneliness of the sea. Number 14, the sea demands a price for passage. Her name was Solveig. She was traveling with her husband, Bjorn, to the Orkney Islands. It was the summer of 910. Bjorn was a warrior who had served his Jarl well. He had been given a small plot of land on Orkney as a reward. It was a new beginning for them. Solveig was nervous but hopeful. She packed seeds from her garden in a small leather pouch. She imagined planting them in the new soil. The voyage from Norway was rough. The ship was a carvey, a smaller vessel, swift but crowded. There were 30 men, and Solveig was one of only 3 women on board. One of the men, a young Dane named Styrbjorn, was loud and boastful. He bragged about the raids he had been on, the silver he had won. He laughed the loudest and sang the most bawdy songs. On the 5th day at sea, the wind died. The men had to row. The work was hard under the summer sun. The oars were long and heavy. They were made of pine, designed to be strong but flexible. Each oar was a massive lever that took 2 men to work effectively in shifts. Styrbjorn was on an oar with an older, quieter man. He complained endlessly. His hands were getting soft, he joked. He was a warrior, not a thrall. During a shift change, Styrbjorn slipped on the wet deck. It was not a dramatic fall. He just lost his footing, and his hand scraped against a splintered section of the gunwale. It was a nasty gash, long and deep, across the palm of his right hand. He cursed, wrapped a piece of cloth around it, and thought little more of it. That was the way of things. Cuts and bruises were part of life. Solveig knew a little about herbs. She offered to clean the wound with boiled seawater and apply a poultice of yarrow she had brought. Styrbjorn laughed at her. He said he was not a child to be fussed over. He said the salt air would heal it. The next day, his hand was swollen. The cloth was stained with a yellow fluid. He stopped joking. He sat by himself, cradling his hand. The day after that, a red line began to snake its way up his arm. He had a fever. He shivered, though the day was warm. His bragging turned to delirious muttering, like there was no healer on board. There was nothing anyone could do. The sea offered no medicine. The ship offered no comfort. Solveig tried to give him water, but he could barely swallow. His arm swelled to twice its normal size, the skin stretched tight and shiny. The smell from the wound was foul. It added another layer to the already thick stench of the ship. The other men avoided him. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear. Sickness on a ship was a dangerous thing. It could spread. It was a sign of bad luck. His presence became a heavy weight on the crew. His groans were a constant grim soundtrack to their journey. On the 8th day, Styrbjorn died. It was a quiet, pathetic end for a man who had been so full of loud life. There was no ceremony, there could be none. The ship had to keep moving. Bjorn and 2 other men took his body. They did not have a proper shroud, so they wrapped him in his own woolen cloak. They tied a small anchor stone they used for shallow moorings to his feet. Solveig watched from the stern. The men said a few short words to the gods. Then they lifted the body and slid it over the side. There was a small splash. The body sank quickly, pulled down by the stone, and then it was gone. The sea closed over him as if he had never existed. There would be no burial mound, no runestone to mark his passing. His family in Denmark would never know how or where he died. They would simply wait for a man who would never return. The mood on the ship was grim. The men were quiet. They looked at their own hands, their own small cuts and scratches, with a new kind of fear. Solveig clutched the small pouch of seeds. She had dreamed of giving life to new soil, but the sea had shown her it was just as quick to take life away. It demanded a price for passage, and that day the price had been a man named Styrbjorn. Number 13, thirst is a more intimate enemy than any blade. His name was Fingeir. He was not a Viking. He was an Irish monk captured in a raid on the monastery at Clonmactwise in the year 842. He was now a thrall, a slave, belonging to a Norse chieftain named Thorgels. They were on a longship, part of a small fleet heading west, back towards a settlement the Norsemen had established in Ireland, a place they called Dublin. Fingeir had thought he understood suffering. He had fasted for days, prayed on cold stone floors, and known the hardship of a monastic life. He was wrong. The suffering of the longship was a different thing entirely. It was a physical and spiritual void. His god seemed very far away. The most pressing misery was not the fear or the degradation, it was thirst. The water was the most precious thing on the ship. It was carried in large tarred leather bags called hudfat, and in a few wooden barrels. The water was brackish from the start, collected from a stream near the coast, but as the days wore on, it became something else. The ship was becalmed. For 6 days the sail hung limp. The sun beat down relentlessly. The world became a shimmering, hazy mirror of sea and sky. The men were forced to row, their bodies slick with sweat, and the water ration was cut. At first it was a cup in the morning and a cup in the evening. Then it was just a cup a day, then half a cup. The waterkeeper, a grim man named Care, guarded the barrels with an axe. He measured out each portion with a small horn cup. His word was law. Fingeir watched men transform. The boisterous warriors became sullen and withdrawn. Their lips cracked, their eyes grew sunken. Their talk was only of water, of springs, of rain, of cool, clear streams. They would stare at the sea, a world of undrinkable water, with a kind of madness in their eyes. The water itself was foul. The barrels were not perfectly sealed. The water grew slimy. Green and brown things floated in it. It smelled of rot and old wood. To drink it was an act of will. Fingeir would hold the horn cup, his hand shaking. He would close his eyes, say a silent prayer, and force the foul liquid down his throat. It did not quench his thirst. It only postponed the inevitable. He began to have visions. He saw the well at his monastery. He could hear the squeak of the rope on the wooden wheel, and he could feel the cold stone of the wellhead. He could taste the pure, clean water. He would wake up with a dry, rasping sob, his tongue a swollen, useless thing in his mouth. One man, a young warrior named Brand, tried to steal a drink during the night. Care did not kill him. Thorgils, the chieftain, forbade it. A dead man could not row. Instead, Brand was given no water at all for a full day. His punishment was to watch the others receive their meager ration. His silent, desperate agony was a lesson to them all. On the 7th day, the wind returned. On the 8th day, it rained. It was not a storm, just a steady, gray drizzle. But it was salvation. Everyone, Norseman and Thrall alike, tilted their heads back, their mouths open to the sky. They used their shields and pieces of leather to catch the precious drops. They wrung out their wet tunics and drank the water that came from them. Fingeir let the rain wash over his face. He licked it from his lips. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. It was life itself. He looked at the warriors around him, their faces streaked with grime, their beards dripping. They were no longer fearsome raiders. They were just men. Men who had been humbled. He understood then that a sword can take a man's life in a moment. But thirst, that was different. Thirst unwound you slowly. It took your strength, your reason, and your soul piece by piece. It was an enemy that fought from the inside out. Number 12, the sun and wind will carve you like wood. His name was Ulf. He was a trader from Birka in what is now Sweden. The year was 950. Ulf was not a warrior. He fought with numbers and silver, not axes. His voyages were long, not for raiding, but for profit. He was on a ship headed south, part of a trade mission to the Caliphate of Cordoba in Al-Andalus, modern Spain. It was a journey of many months, a calculated risk for a huge reward. Ulf was used to the northern sun, a pale, gentle thing that warmed the skin but rarely burned. He was not prepared for the sun of the Bay of Biscay. As they sailed south along the coast of Francia, the world changed. The sky became a hard, brilliant blue. The sun was not a friend. It was a hammer. There was no escape. The woolen sail offered some shade, but the crew had to work. They had to manage the rigging, watch for dangers, and sometimes row. Ulf's perch was in the stern, near the steersman. He had his trade goods, amber and furs, carefully wrapped in oilcloth below the deckboards, but he himself lived in the open. His skin, pale from a long Swedish winter, began to burn on the second day of clear skies. At first, it was just a pink glow. Then it deepened to an angry red. His face, his neck, his hands, any part of him not covered by his tunic and cloak, felt like it was on fire. By the 4th day, his skin began to blister. Small, painful pockets of fluid rose on his nose and ears. He tried to cover himself. He pulled his hood up, but the heat was stifling. He looked at the seasoned sailors. Their skin was the color of old leather, wrinkled and tough. They seemed immune. They told him to use fish oil. He smeared the stinking grease on his face. It offered little protection and made him smell foul, but it was all they had. And then came the peeling. Sheets of skin came off his face, leaving raw, tender flesh underneath. The salt spray felt like acid on the new skin. He was in constant, low-grade pain. But the sun was only one half of the assault. The wind was the other. It was relentless, a constant pressure on the skin. Hour after hour, day after day. It was not the biting cold wind of the north. This was a dry, chafing wind that stole the moisture from his body. His lips cracked, the corners of his mouth split open, and every time he tried to eat the hard, salty tack, the cracks would bleed. His eyes were constantly watering from the wind, and the glare off the water, leaving them red and raw. He saw what the sun and wind did to the ship. The timbers dried and shrank. The tar in the seams bubbled and cracked. The woolen sail, a vibrant red with black stripes when they left Birka, was now faded to a pale, dusty pink. The ship was being weathered, worn down by the elements, and Ulf felt like he was too. One of the older sailors, a man named Sten, showed Ulf his hands. They were a mass of calluses, scars, and deep cracks. "The sea is a sculptor," Sten said, his voice a dry rasp. "It carves the ship. It carves the man. It wears away everything soft." Ulf looked at his own blistered, peeling hands. He was a man of soft things, of fine cloth, polished amber, and smooth silver coins. This world was hard. It was abrasive. He felt like he was being scraped away layer by layer. The profit he hoped to make in Cordoba seemed a distant, abstract thing. The reality was the burning of his skin, the sting of the salt, and the constant wearing pressure of the wind. He was being remade, not by choice, but by the slow, brutal artistry of the elements. He was becoming as weathered as the ship he sailed on. Number 11, your hunger will make you a stranger to yourself. Her name was Ragna. She was not a shield maiden from the sagas. She was a farmer's wife from Jutland. The year was 865. Her husband Leif had decided to join the great army invading England. He was not a great warrior, but the promise of land and silver was too strong to ignore. Ragna refused to be left behind. She packed what she could, including their 2 young children, a boy named Eric and a girl named Aslog, and boarded the longship. She thought she had packed sacks of dried peas, smoked herring, and a small keg of butter sealed with wax. She thought it would be enough. She was naive. The voyage across the North Sea was supposed to take a few days, but a storm blew them off course. Then they were becalmed. Days turned into a week, then 2. The ship's stores were managed by a man named Halfdan. He was fair but grim. The rations were cut. Then they were cut again. The food was not just scarce, it was a trial to eat. The main food was ship's biscuit, or hardtack. It was a simple flour and water biscuit, baked until it was as hard as a rock. It had to be soaked in water or ale to be edible, but the ship's ale was gone, and the water was foul. And Ragna would soak the biscuit for her children. She would watch them gnaw on the tough, leathery bread. Sometimes she would find weevils in it, small black insects. At first she picked them out meticulously. After a week she stopped. The insects were just another part of the meal. She told her children they were peppercorns. The dried fish was hard and intensely salty. It made their thirst worse. They would chew on a small piece for an hour, trying to make it last. The smoked herring she had brought was a treasure. She doled it out in tiny slivers. When it was gone, a profound sense of despair settled over her. Her children began to weaken. Eric, her son, grew listless. His gums became sore and started to bleed. He cried from the pain when he tried to chew. Ragna did not know the word for scurvy. She only knew her son was fading before her eyes. She felt a desperation she had never known, a primal animal hunger that overshadowed everything. One of the ship's goats, brought for milk, had gone dry and then died of sickness. The men butchered it. The meat was stringy and tough, but it was fresh. Ragna managed to trade a small silver brooch for a piece of the liver. She cooked it over the small firebox in the center of the ship, a stone-lined box filled with sand where they could have a carefully managed fire. She fed the precious meat to her children first, watching them with a fierce, protective gaze. She saw the change in people. A man was caught stealing another's ration of biscuit. He was not flogged or killed. The chieftain simply declared that the man would receive no more rations for 3 days. It was a death sentence delivered quietly. The man did not beg or fight. He just sat, staring at nothing, a hollowed-out shell. Ragna found she could not feel pity for him. She only felt a cold knot of fear. She would have done the same for her children. She would have stolen, she would have killed. The hunger ate away at more than their bodies. It ate their kindness, their fellowship. The crew, once a band of comrades, became a collection of hungry individuals, each jealously guarding their tiny portion of food. When they finally made landfall in East Anglia, Ragna was a different woman. She was thinner, harder. The soft edges of her face were gone, replaced by sharp angles. She looked at the green English shore not with hope, but with a raw, desperate need. She was no longer just a farmer's wife. She was a survivor. She had learned the first and most brutal lesson of a long voyage. Your body has needs that will shout down your conscience, your morals, your very identity. Hunger would make you do things you never thought possible. It would make you a stranger to the person you thought you were. Number 10, sickness has nowhere to go. His name was Eric, but they called him Eric the Red for the color of his hair and his temper. The year was 982. He had been exiled from Iceland for killing a man. He was sailing west, searching for a land that a man named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson had sighted decades before. He had two ships, his family, his thralls, and a handful of followers who were loyal or desperate enough to follow an outlaw into the unknown. One of these followers was a man named Catil. He was a carpenter, a valuable man on such a voyage. His job was to maintain the ship, to fix what broke. He was strong, quiet, and good with his hands. About a week into their voyage, while repairing a section of the railing that had been damaged in a squall, a wooden peg he was hammering split. A long, sharp splinter of oak drove itself deep into the fleshy part of his forearm. He cursed, pulled it out, and bled for a while. His wife Thora, who was also on the ship, cleaned it as best she could with a cloth dipped in seawater and bound it tightly. It was a common injury, no one thought much of it, but on a longship there is no such thing as a clean environment. The decks were slick with a mixture of sea spray, fish guts from the daily catch, and the occasional waste from the livestock they carried. Hands were never truly clean. The splinter had introduced something unseen into Kettle's arm. 2 days later, the arm was hot to the touch and swollen. The area around the small wound was an angry red. Kettle felt a deep, throbbing pain that kept him from sleeping. He developed a fever. Thora did what she could. She changed the dressing, but the pus that seeped from the wound was thick and smelled foul. She knew of some herbs for healing, but they were all on land, far away. The ship's medicine chest was small and contained little more than some dried moss for dressing wounds and perhaps a few charms against sea monsters. Eric came to see him. He looked at the arm and his face was grim. A sick man on a ship is a liability. A sick man in the middle of an uncharted ocean is a dead man. There was no healer, no like near. In their world, medicine was a mix of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and superstition. For something like this, a deep infection, they had no answer. Kettle's condition worsened rapidly. The fever consumed him. He became delirious, shouting at ghosts from his past. His arm turned a dark, purplish color. The skin stretched so tight it looked like it might split. The smell of the infection was now so strong that people tried to stay upwind of him. He was isolated, not by command, but by a natural, primal fear. The others gave him a wide berth. They did not want to be near the sickness, near the smell of death. Thora stayed by his side, her face a mask of helpless grief. She spooned foul water between his cracked lips, but he was barely conscious. The sickness had nowhere to go. On land, a sick person could be isolated in a separate hut. They could be tended to, perhaps find a healer with the right knowledge. On the ship, everyone was trapped together. Kettle's suffering was a public spectacle. His groans filled the small silences between the creak of the mast and the wash of the waves. His decay was happening in front of them all. He died on the 10th day of the voyage. His body was fever hot, and his arm was black. They wrapped him in a sailcloth, weighted his feet with stones, and slid him into the cold, gray water of the Greenland Sea. Thora sat alone, staring at the spot where he had disappeared. The ship sailed on. There was no time to mourn. The routine had to continue. The watches had to be kept. The sails had to be trimmed. But a shadow lay over the crew. They were all one small cut, one splinter, one infected wound away from Kettle's fate. On the open sea, your own body could become your most deadly enemy, and there was absolutely nowhere you could run from it. Number 9, you will read the history of the voyage. His name was Ari. He was a skald, a poet, in the service of a Norwegian jarl. It was the year 1015, and he was part of an embassy to the court of King Knut in England. For a man who worked with words, with the ephemeral beauty of language, the reality of the longship was a brutal assault on the senses. The most overwhelming, the most inescapable was the smell. It was not one smell, but a thick, complex tapestry of odors that permeated everything. It was the first thing you noticed in the morning and the last thing that clung to you as you drifted into a fitful sleep. Ari tried to find words for it, to capture it in a kenning, but, the reality was too foul for poetry. The foundation of the smell was the ship itself. The oak hull was coated in a thick layer of pine tar for waterproofing. On warm days, the tar would soften and release a pungent, acrid smell that caught in the back of the throat. Mixed with this was the constant, damp, musty odor of the wool sail and the ropes, which never fully dried. Then there was the bilge, the bottom of the ship. Beneath the removable deck boards was a dark, wet space. Seawater inevitably leaked through the seams of the hull. This water did not stay clean. It mixed with anything that fell through the cracks, spilled ale, bits of discarded food, vomit, dirt, and animal waste. The bilge water was a stinking, stagnant soup. Part of the daily routine was bailing it out, sending buckets of the foul liquid over the side. But you could never get all of it. The smell of the bilge was a permanent resident, a miasma of decay that rose up through the floorboards. The crew added their own layer. There were 50 men on the ship, and they had been at sea for over a week. They wore the same woolen tunics they had started in. There was no way to wash. Their bodies were sticky with salt and sweat. The collective smell of unwashed humanity was a heavy, greasy presence in the air, and there were the animals. For this diplomatic journey, the Jarl had brought gifts, including several fine hunting falcons. The birds were tethered to perches, and their droppings added a sharp ammonia-like tang to the air. On other journeys, Ari had sailed with sheep, goats, even cattle, and the stench was 100 times worse. Seasickness was another contributor. Not everyone had their sea legs. On the first few days of rough weather, several of the younger men were violently ill. They would lean over the side, but, the wind would often blow the vomit back onto the ship, where it would run into the scuppers and add its sour note to the bilge. Even the food smelled. The dried cod had a powerful fishy odor that clung to your hands and beard. The soured fermented milk they drank was an acquired taste, and its sharp smell was everywhere. The butter, stored in a wooden tub, was starting to go rancid, giving off a cheesy, pungent aroma. Ari found that he could not escape it. The smell was in his clothes, in his hair, in his beard. It was on his skin. When he ate, the food tasted of the ship's stench. He would lie on his sleeping skins at night, pull his cloak over his head, and still, the smell would be there, a ghostly presence in the small, dark space. He watched the veteran sailors. They did not seem to notice. They ate, slept, and worked within the cloud of stench as if it were the most natural air in the world. They had become accustomed to it. Ari realized that was the only way to survive. You had to let the smell become a part of you. You had to breathe in the history of the voyage, every meal, every sick man, every animal, every drop of stagnant bilge water. To be on the ship was to breathe the ship. There was no other choice. Number 8. The ocean sings a song of infinite boredom. Her name was Freydis Eriksdottir. She was the daughter of Eric the Red. The sagas paint her as a fierce, ambitious woman. And she was. But the sagas leave out the long stretches of nothing that come between the moments of action. In the year 1014, she was a partner in an expedition to Vinland, the third major attempt to colonize the New World. She was on a Nar, a cargo ship, crossing the North Atlantic. It was a journey of weeks. The first few days were exciting. The coast of Greenland faded behind them. The feeling of heading into the unknown was a sharp thrill. The crew was busy, their movements efficient and practiced. They knew the rhythms of the ship, the language of the wind, and the sails. But after a week, a profound and deep-seated boredom began to set in. The world shrank to the circle of the horizon. The view never changed. Gray water, gray sky. Sometimes the sun came out, and the water would turn blue and sparkle. Sometimes a fog rolled in, and the world would become a small, damp bubble of gray. But the essential nature of the view was its sameness. The routine of the ship was relentless and monotonous. Stand, watch, sleep, eat, check the ropes, bail the bilge. Stand, watch again. The tasks were necessary for survival, but they were repetitive. The conversations, at first lively with plans and hopes for Vinland, soon dried up. There was only so much to say. They had all told their stories. They all knew each other's histories. Her Freydis was a woman of action. The idleness gnawed her. She would pace the deck, the 10 or so strides from the mast to the stern, over and over until the sailors began to look at her with amusement. She tried to keep busy. She would mend a tear in her cloak, her stitches small and angry. She would sharpen her personal knife until the edge was fearsome. But these tasks took only a short time. The hours of the day stretched out vast and empty. There was no reading. The books were rare and precious things, not to be risked on a wet ship. The only entertainment was what they could create themselves. In the evenings, if the weather was calm, one of the men might tell a story. He would recite the tales of the gods, of Thor and Odin, or the sagas of great heroes like Sigurd the Dragonslayer. The crew would listen, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a fish oil lamp. But even the greatest stories grew stale with repetition. Sometimes they would sing. Sea shanties, songs of home, mournful ballads. The music was a comfort, a way to fill the oppressive silence. But it was a small thing against the vastness of the ocean. Fridas watched the men. Some would carve wood. They would take a piece of driftwood or a spare block of pine and with a small knife create intricate knots, animal heads, or small figures. It was a way to pass the time, to focus the mind on something small and controllable. Others would play games. Or they had a Nefertafel board, a game of strategy, and the pieces made of bone were worn smooth from countless games. But even games lost their appeal. The real enemy on these long, calm stretches was the mind. It would turn inward. Old grievances would fester, small irritations would magnify into major insults, a man who chewed his food too loudly, a woman who hummed the same tune off key. These things became unbearable. The enforced proximity and the crushing boredom created a tense, volatile atmosphere. Euphrates found herself staring at the waves for hours, watching the patterns, the rise and fall, the endless, meaningless motion. The ocean song was not one of adventure. It was a low, constant drone of indifference. It sang a song of infinite boredom. And it was in these long, empty hours, more than in any storm, that the true test of a person's will was found. It was a battle not against the sea, but against the vast, empty spaces it opened inside your own soul. Number 7, you are always damp and sometimes frozen. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson. He was a merchant captain from Iceland. The year was 986. He was attempting to sail to Greenland to join his father, who had gone there with Eric the Red. He was a skilled sailor, but the North Atlantic is a fickle and cruel master. He was about to learn a lesson in the misery of being wet. He had a good ship, a sturdy Nar built for cargo, but no Viking ship was truly waterproof. They were designed to be flexible, to ride the waves. This meant the planks of the hull, held together with iron rivets and sealed with tarred animal hair, would shift and work in heavy seas. And where they shifted, water would get in. A storm hit them 3 days out from Iceland. It was not a violent ship-breaking tempest, but a miserable 3-day blow with high winds and a relentless driving rain. The sky and the sea merged into a single churning wall of gray. The first thing to fail was the jald, the large woolen tent that served as a roof. It was heavy with rain and the wind tore at it, ripping one of the seams. Cold seawater began to drip, then pour onto the men huddled beneath it. There was no escape. Bjarni's clothes were made of wool. Wool is a remarkable material. It can keep you warm even when wet. This is what people always say. What they do not say is how it feels. It feels like wearing a lead blanket. His tunic and trousers were saturated, heavy, and cold. The water wicked its way through the wool, chilling him to the bone. His skin became clammy and pale. The sea spray was constant. It came over the side in sheets, drenching everything and everyone. It was not like rain, it was salt water. As it dried, it left a crust of salt on his skin, his beard, his clothes. This salty crust would chafe. The skin under his arms and between his legs became raw and red. Every movement was a small agony. Sleep was almost impossible. He would try to find the driest spot on the ship, usually curled up against the base of the mast. He would pull his soaking wet cloak over him, but the dampness was inside his clothes against his skin. He would shiver uncontrollably, a deep racking shudder that started in his core and shook his whole body. This was the first stage of what we now call hypothermia. To Bjarni, it was just the sea cold, a known danger of his profession. He knew men who had died from it, who had simply gone to sleep in their wet clothes and and never woken up. His hands suffered the most. He had to work the ropes, manage the steering oar. The ropes were stiff and cold with seawater. His hands became numb, clumsy things. He lost all feeling in his fingertips. When he would go to grip a rope, he had to look to make sure his hand had actually closed around it. He knew that when the feeling came back, it would be a searing needle-like pain. Even when the storm passed, the dampness remained. Nothing ever truly dried. The air was heavy with moisture. The wood of the ship was dark with it. His sleeping skins were perpetually clammy. He dreamed of a warm, dry fire. He could almost feel the heat on his face, the pleasure of steam rising from his clothes. It was a vision of paradise. For 3 weeks, Bjarni and his crew were lost in a fog bank blown far south of their course. They lived in a world of gray mist and constant damp. They were cold, miserable, and their bodies ached from the perpetual chill. It was on this miserable voyage that he and his crew would become the first Europeans to sight the coast of North America, a land of trees and hills. But the saga's record that they did not go ashore. They were tired, they were wet, they were cold. All they wanted was to find Greenland, to find their families, to get dry. The discovery of a new continent was secondary to the simple, overwhelming human need for warmth and shelter. The brutal reality of the sea had worn away their capacity for wonder. Number 6. The ship is your mother, and she is trying to die. His name was Olaf, not the king, but a shipwright from the Trondheim fjord. It was his first long voyage on a ship he had helped build. The year was 1025. The ship was a Skade, a large long ship over 100 feet long, built for war. It was beautiful, long, sleek, with a fearsome dragon head on the prow. Olaf was proud of his work. He knew every plank, every rivet, and that was the problem. He knew everything that could go wrong. A Viking ship was not a rigid, unmoving vessel. It was designed to be flexible, almost alive. The oak planks of the hull were clinker-built, meaning they overlapped. They were fastened with iron rivets. This construction allowed the hull to twist and flex with the waves rather than fighting against them. On a calm sea, this was a thing of beauty. In a storm, it was terrifying. Olaf did not sleep like the other men. He listened. The ship had a language, and he was one of the few who could understand it. He lay on the deck, his ear pressed against the planks, and he listened to the voice of the ship. There was the constant creak and groan of the timbers. This was the normal sound of a healthy ship, the sound of the wood flexing as it should. But Olaf listened for the sharp, cracking sounds, a sound like a breaking bone. That meant a plank had split under the strain. He listened for the high-pitched screech of a rivet pulling loose from the wood. The mast was the heart of the ship. It was a single, massive pine tree, held in place by a huge block of oak called the curling, and supported by a web of ropes made from walrus hide or hemp. In high winds, the mast would bend like a bow. Olaf would watch it, his heart in his throat. He could hear the wood fibers groaning under the immense pressure. A broken mast in the open ocean was a death sentence. The steering oar, the styrie, mounted on the right side the steerboard or starboard side of the ship, was another point of failure. It was a massive oar, controlled by a tiller. It took all the force of the sea. Olaf had seen one snap in a storm, the ship instantly losing control, turning broadside to the waves and swamping. He would constantly check the lashings that held it, the wooden peg that was its pivot point. But the most insidious enemy was the water. The ship was always taking on water. The seams, sealed with tarred animal hair, were never perfectly tight. Water would seep in, drip by drip, filling the bilge. That was why bailing was a constant, back-breaking chore. But sometimes a leak was more serious. A plank could work loose, a seam burst, then the water would not drip, it would gush. During a storm off the coast of Scotland, Olaf heard a new sound. A low, gurgling noise from below the deck boards, accompanied by a frantic shout from the men near the bow. A seam had opened. He and 2 other men pried up the floorboards. Water was pouring in, a thick, black torrent in the dim light. There was no panic, just grim, focused action. While some men bailed with a frantic energy using leather buckets, Olaf and the others had to fix the leak. The ship was their mother, the vessel that kept them alive, and she was bleeding out. The repair was a nightmare. They had to stuff wedges of wood and cloth into the gap from the inside, fighting against the pressure of the sea. They were soaked, working in the dark, stinking bilge, the water rising around their knees. They took a spare woolen cloak, soaked it in tar from a small bucket they kept for repairs, and forced it into the seam, hammering it in with a wooden mallet. It was a desperate, ugly fix. But it worked. The gush slowed to a trickle. Olaf did not feel pride. He felt a cold, deep exhaustion. He understood. The beautiful ship he had built was a fragile thing, and the ocean was constantly trying to reclaim the wood, to pull apart the seams, to break the mast. The ship was a living thing, but it was also a dying thing. Every voyage was a fight to keep her alive for one more day. And if you failed, she would take you with her to the bottom. Number 5, you are navigating by ghost stories. His name was Floki. The sagas would call him Hrafnafloki or Raven Floki. The year was 868. He was a Norseman, and he was determined to find the land that another sailor, Gardar Svavarsson, had discovered and called Gardarsholm. We know it as Iceland. Floki was a bold man, but his tools for finding a speck of land in the middle of a vast ocean were primitive, bordering on magical. You know, he had no compass. The magnetic compass would not come to Europe for another 200 years. He had no charts as we would recognize them. The maps of the era were vague, distorted things, more art than science. His primary navigation tool was experience and a set of instructions passed down orally. Sail west from the mountains of western Norway for 7 days with a good wind. What was a good wind? How fast was the ship going? It was all guesswork. His primary instrument was the sun. On a clear day, he could tell the time and maintain a rough east-west direction by the sun's position. At night, he had the stars. He knew Polaris, the North Star. He could find it and keep the ship on a westward course. But this was the North Atlantic. Clear days and nights were a gift, not a guarantee. For much of his voyage, the sky was a blanket of gray cloud. The sun was gone, the stars were hidden, the ship was sailing blind, a current could be pushing them south. A wind could be shifting them north. He had no way of knowing. The fear of being lost was a cold, constant companion for the entire crew. To run out of food and water while searching for land that might not even be there was the ultimate nightmare. This is where the ravens came in. Floki had brought 3 ravens with him. This was his secret weapon. It was an old sailor's trick. After several days of sailing, when he thought he might be getting close to land, he released the first raven. The bird flew up, circled the ship, and then headed straight back east, towards the familiar shores of Norway. Floki knew he had not traveled far enough. They sailed on. A few days later, he released the second raven. This one also circled the ship, but then it flew up high, hovered for a moment, and then returned to the mast. It was confused, it could see no land in any direction, they were truly in the middle of nowhere. The crew grew anxious. The world felt empty. They sailed west for one more day, a journey made on pure faith. Floki released his third and final raven. The bird soared into the air, circled once, and then flew purposefully to the west. It did not return. Floki knew land was in that direction. He ordered the ship to follow the raven's path. It worked. They found Iceland. But the method reveals the terrifying reality of their navigation. They were relying on the instincts of a bird. They were navigating by signs and portents, by stories of other sailors, by the feel of the wind and the color of the water. They looked for seabirds, knowing they had to roost on land at night. They watched for cloud formations that often gather over islands. They even claimed to be able to smell land on the wind. Even with the sun, they had a clever tool called a sunstone, the solarstein. This was likely a piece of calcite or another polarizing crystal. By holding it up to the overcast sky and rotating it, a navigator could find the direction of the sun even when it was hidden by clouds. It was a remarkable piece of science, but it was not foolproof. It was another small piece of information in a massive puzzle of uncertainty. For Floki and every other Viking captain, a long-haul voyage was an act of faith. They were sailing on a sea of rumor, guided by ghost stories from sailors who had come before them. Every landmark that disappeared behind them was the last known point in their universe. Ahead was just a story, a promise, and a terrifying, empty expanse of water. Getting lost was not a possibility, it was an expected part of the journey. Finding your destination was often a matter of pure dumb luck. Number 4, your only privacy is a wooden box. His name was Thorstein. He was not a jarl or a great warrior. He was a farmer from a small holding near a fjord. It was the year 995, and he was part of the crew sailing with Olaf Tryggvason on his return to Norway to claim the kingship. Thorstein was not there for glory or politics. He had a wife and a young son. He was there because his jarl had ordered it, and the pay was good. Before he left, his wife, Ingrid, had given him a small carved wooden bird, a tern. She had said it would fly over him and keep him safe. He held it in his hand. It was smooth and cool. He had nowhere to put it. The longship was a warship. It was built for speed and fighting, not comfort. 60 men lived on its open deck. There were no cabins, no rooms, no walls. The only piece of personal space each man had was his sea chest, his kista. Thorstein's kista was made of pine bound with iron strips. It was about 3 feet long, 1.5 feet wide, and 1.5 feet deep. It was not large, but it was his entire world. Inside, he kept his spare wool tunic, his leather shoes for land, a whetstone for his knife, a comb made of bone, and a small pouch of silver coins. And now, the wooden tern. During the day, the kista was his seat. The rowing benches ran down the sides of the ship, but when not rowing, the men would sit on their chests, crammed together, their knees practically touching the back of the man in front. He would eat his meals sitting on his kista, using the lid as a small, unstable table. At night, the kista was his headboard. He would lay his sleeping bag, a sheepskin-lined leather sack, on the deck boards. He would use his chest to protect his head from the trampling feet of the men on watch. Sleep was a public affair. He slept surrounded by the snores, coughs, and muttered dreams of 59 other men. He learned to sleep through anything. The kista was his fortress. It was the only thing on the ship that was truly his. It was an unwritten rule, a sacred law of the sea, that no man touches another man's chest. To do so was a profound insult, an invitation to a knife fight. It was the one boundary that was respected in a world with no other boundaries. Inside that box was his identity, his connection to home. In the quiet moments of a night watch, he would open the lid just a crack. He would not light a lamp. And he would just reach inside and touch his belongings. He would feel the rough weave of his spare tunic and remember Ingrid weaving it by the fire. He would run his thumb over the smooth surface of the carved tern. It was a secret conversation with his life on land. One day, a sudden squall hit the ship. A large wave washed over the side, drenching everything. The chests, not being waterproof, were soaked. The men were furious, not just at being wet, but at the violation of their one private space. Thorstein opened his chest. His spare tunic was soaked in salt water, his leather shoes were ruined, but he had wrapped the wooden bird in a piece of oilcloth. He took it out. It was dry. He sat on his wet chest, in his wet clothes, surrounded by wet, angry men, and he held the small wooden bird. He was in a world of absolute publicity where every action was seen, every word was heard. But for a moment, holding that small carving, he was alone. He was home. He understood the Kista was more than a box for storing things. It was a psychological anchor. It was the one place he could store the part of himself that was not a sailor, not a warrior, but a husband and a father. It was a tiny locked room for his soul in the middle of a wide, open, and brutally public world. His only privacy was a wooden box, and it was just enough. Number 3. The relentless grind wears down the body. His name was Magnus. He was a stonemason from the island of Gotland. The year was 970. He was on a trading voyage to the east down the rivers of the Rus to the great city of Miklagard, Constantinople. He was not a sailor by trade, but he was strong and his hands were hard from his work. He thought he knew what hard work was. He was about to be re-educated. The ship was a smaller, lighter vessel designed for rivers. It could be sailed, but much of the journey required rowing. And rowing on a Viking ship was not the rhythmic, leisurely activity seen in films. It was a form of torture. The oars were long and heavy, made of pine or ash. They pivoted on oarlocks or capes, which were simple wooden blocks lashed to the gunwale. The rowing benches were the men's own sea chests. There was no sliding seat, no ergonomic design. It was raw, brutal muscle power. Magnus was assigned to an oar with a man named Svein. The work began at dawn. The rhythm was set by a coxswain who would chant or beat a drum. It was a slow, grinding rhythm. Dip the oar, pull, lift, feather, repeat for hours. The first hour was manageable. The second hour, Magnus's back began to ache. The muscles in his shoulders and arms burned. The third hour, his hands started to blister. The rough wood of the oar handle, combined with the salt water, rubbed his palms raw. He tried to adjust his grip, but there was no comfortable way to hold it. By the fourth hour, the pain was a constant, throbbing companion. It was not just in his muscles. His joints ached. His wrists, his elbows, his lower back. The simple wooden chest he sat on offered no support. Every pull sent a jolt of pain through his spine. He looked at the veteran sailors. Their faces were blank masks of concentration. They had learned to go somewhere else in their minds, to disconnect from the pain in their bodies. They would row in shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, but the time off was not rest. In his off hours, Magnus had other duties. The most hated was bailing the bilge. He would use a wooden bucket to scoop the stinking, slimy water from the bottom of the boat and throw it overboard. It was awkward, messy work that left him soaked and smelling foul. Then there was the sail. The sail was made of heavy wool, reinforced with a leather grid. It weighed hundreds of pounds. When the wind shifted, the sail had to be managed. This involved pulling on thick, stiff ropes made of walrus hide. The ropes were abrasive and unforgiving. Magnus's already blistered hands were cut and scraped. The salt in the water made the cuts sting with an intensity that made him gasp. There was no weekend. There was no day of rest. The work was as constant as the rising and setting of the sun. Row, bail, mend the ropes, adjust the sail, stand watch, eat a miserable meal of hard bread and saltfish. Try to sleep for a few hours, wake up and do it all again. His body began to change. He lost weight, but his shoulders and back became thick with muscle. His hands, after blistering and bleeding, became a solid mass of calluses as hard as leather. He was stronger than he had ever been, but he felt 100 years old. A deep bone-weary exhaustion settled into him that sleep could not cure. One evening, after a grueling 10-hour stretch of rowing against a strong river current, he sat on his chest, too tired to even eat. He watched the riverbank slide by. He was a stonemason. He created things that lasted for centuries. Churches, monuments, runestones. This work, the work of the ship, was the opposite. It was ephemeral. You rowed and the river flowed back. You bailed and the ship leaked more. You mended a rope and another one frayed. It was an endless grinding battle against entropy. It was work that was never ever done, and it wore you down, body and soul, one agonizing pull of the oar at a time. Number 2, your greatest enemy is the emptiness. Her name was Gudrun. She was a young woman from the Western Isles of Scotland of mixed Norse and Gaelic heritage. The year was 930. She was on a ship bound for Iceland, where she was to be married to a man she had never met, a political alliance arranged by her father. She was not a prisoner, but she did not feel free. The first few days, the fear was of concrete things. The waves were huge, mountains of dark water that threatened to swamp the small Nar. The wind shrieked in the rigging like a banshee. She was terrified of the ship breaking apart, of being thrown into the icy water. She feared the Viking crew, rough men with hard eyes and sharp axes. But the storm passed. The sea grew calm. The crew, she learned, were just men. They mostly ignored her. A new kind of fear began to creep in, one that was much worse than the storm. It was the fear of the emptiness. She would stand at the rail and look out. In every direction there was nothing, just the flat, endless expanse of water meeting the vast, empty dome of the sky. The ship was a tiny, insignificant speck of wood in a universe of gray. It was a scale that her mind could not properly grasp. She had grown up surrounded by mountains and islands. There was always a landmark, a sense of place. Here, there was no place. There was only here, a floating piece of nowhere. This physical emptiness created a psychological one. The days were long and silent, broken only by the creak of the ship and the cry of the occasional gull. The emptiness outside started to seep inside her. She felt hollowed out. Her life in Scotland, her family, the hills she knew, all seemed like a dream. The future, her marriage to a stranger in a land of ice and fire, was an abstract terror. All that was real was the ship and the void. She saw it in the eyes of the crew. During long watches, a sailor would stare at the horizon with an unfocused gaze. His face would be slack, his expression blank. They called it the say days. It was a kind of trance, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming scale of the ocean. Her own thoughts became a dangerous country. With nothing external to occupy her mind, it turned on itself. Small worries became monstrous anxieties. A remembered insult from her childhood would play over and over in her head. The face of the man she was to marry, described to her as stout and fair, would morph in her imagination into something grotesque. Her paranoia began to set in. Were the crew whispering about her? Did the steersman give her a hostile look? The nights were the worst. If the sky was clear, the stars were a terrifying spectacle. Not the familiar patterns she knew, but a cold, glittering blanket of infinite distance. It did not make her feel small in a comforting way. It made her feel utterly, completely insignificant. She began to understand the Viking belief in sea monsters, the Hafgufa, the Kraken. In that vast, empty expanse with the light playing tricks on the water, it was easy to believe that anything could rise from the depths. The emptiness had to be filled with something. If not land, then monsters. Fear was better than nothingness. Gudrun learned to cope by focusing on the small things. The pattern of the wood grain on the railing. The way the light hit a drop of water on a rope. The life in the ship itself. The scuttling of a ship's rat, the crowing of a rooster in its cage. These small living things were an anchor against the great dead emptiness that surrounded them. She realized the true battle of a sea voyage was not against the weather or the waves, and it was a fight against the despair that the emptiness could breed. It was a struggle to hold on to your own mind when the world gave you nothing to hold on to. The fear of a storm was real, but it was a fear of something. The fear of the void was a fear of everything and nothing all at once. Number 1, you go to sea, but you never truly come home. His name was Leif. He was a young man from a village near Roskilde in Denmark. The year was 793. He had joined a crew for a summer voyage. They did not call it raiding. They called it going Viking. It was a rite of passage, a way to gain wealth, reputation, and experience of the world. He was excited. He kissed his mother goodbye, clasped his father's arm, and promised his younger sister he would bring her back a present. He thought he would be gone for a few months. The voyage was hard. He experienced all of it. The seasickness, the bad food, the wet, the cold, the fear, the boredom. They sailed west towards the coast of Northumbria. They found a monastery on a small island called Lindisfarne. It was poorly defended. The raid was quick and brutal. They took gold crosses, silver chalices, and jeweled book covers. They took food and livestock. Leif fought. He did not kill anyone, but he saw it happen. He saw the terror in the eyes of the monks. He heard their prayers turn to screams. They sailed home, their ship heavy with plunder. The mood was triumphant. They feasted and sang. Leif was given his share, a silver arm ring and a handful of coins. He was a wealthy man by the standards of his village. When he walked back into his family's longhouse, they treated him like a hero. His father clapped him on the back. His mother wept with relief. His sister stared at the beautiful silver chain he gave her, a piece of the plunder. But something was wrong. Leif found he could not sleep in the quiet stillness of his own bed. He was used to the rocking of the ship, the sound of the waves and the wind. The silence of the night was deafening. He would lie awake for hours, his ears straining for sounds that were not there. The food tasted bland. He had grown accustomed to the intense saltiness of dried fish and the sour tang of fermented milk. His mother's fresh bread and sweet porridge felt strange in his mouth. He could not relate to the concerns of his friends. They talked of the harvest, of a dispute over a boundary fence, of a pretty girl in the next village. Leif had seen a world they could not comprehend. He had crossed the Great Whale Road. He had seen a stone building bigger than any longhouse. He had seen men die. Their talk seemed small, childish. He felt a gulf between himself and them, a distance that had nothing to do with miles. He was restless. The predictable rhythm of farm life, which had once been his whole world, now felt like a cage. He would find himself walking to the shore, staring out at the sea, feeling a strange pull. He missed the ship. He missed the camaraderie of the crew, the shared hardship that forged a bond stronger than friendship. He even missed the misery because it was a misery with a purpose. His family noticed the change. He was quieter, more distant. His eyes had a faraway look. His father said the sea had gotten into his blood. His mother worried he had left his soul on the waves. Leif understood. The young man who had left that summer had not returned. That boy was gone, lost somewhere on the North Sea. In his place was a man who had been remade by the brutal realities of the voyage. The ship, the sea, the raid, they had scraped away his innocence. They had replaced it with something harder, colder. He knew he would go to sea again the next spring, and the spring after that. He was no longer just a farmer's son. He was a Viking. It was not a choice he made. It was a change that had happened to him. The voyage had given him wealth and status, but it had taken something too. It had taken his sense of belonging. He had a home, a family who loved him, but he no longer fit there. You could sail away from home, and you could sail back, but you could never truly return. A part of you would always be out there, on the gray, empty water, forever adrift.